Thank you very much. And thanks for that very kind introduction and the video to boot. It is a real honor for me to be with you this afternoon. Just a quick moment on the Center for Japanese Economy and Business. Center implies something specific. It has to be the center of something. In this center's case, in all our centers, that center is research and practice. Japanese economy and business are intertwined, obviously. At Columbia Business School, we spend a lot of time with students on how business decisions have economic effects. And there is a lot going on, obviously, today for the Japanese economy and business, intertwined with the American economy and business. In that regard, I am very grateful both to CJEB and especially to Hugh for his leadership, and look forward to David Weinstein's leadership. It's a special honor later in the afternoon to hear from Deputy Prime Minister Aso, with whom I had the privilege of serving at a point in time. And it's an honor to be here during President Trump's visit to Japan, and of course the backdrop of the upcoming Osaka summit. It is important to remember, and Hugh already laid this out, that the United States and Japan have largely common interests, and those common interests, particularly in trade, are important. A personal story, since I see Mr. Mogi in the front row, I had the privilege of going to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the center of the United States, with Heizo Takanaka, who had served also at the same time with me in government, to talk about the benefits of international trade, both for American agriculture and for Japanese business. Kikkoman's investment in the heartland of America was essentially the first major Japanese investment in the United States. My task today, since Hugh told me I don't have all day, I only have a few minutes with you, is to set the stage for the Trump economy in the United States, but to focus particularly on issues of trade. And I will do that through a somewhat different lens than I expect your panel is going to do. I'm going to talk about major shifts in G20 economies that I expect to be the subject of the Osaka summit, that come from both technological change and international trade, with impacts that are political as well as economic. And your first panel on trade, I think, will be important in that context. By way of backdrop, just a quick mention of the U.S. economy. I give President Trump significant credit as an economist for resetting growth expectations in the United States. It is a rare business person who does not have more of a spring in his or her step after the election. Growth prospects actually shifted, but more important perhaps, expectations shifted. There have been very constructive corporate tax changes in the United States, and some very supportive regulatory changes, very good Federal Reserve appointees thus far. Trade is an area in which the president has been much more controversial, and that I want to make the subject of my remarks. And in that regard, against the backdrop of conviviality that we saw for President Trump here with golf and sumo wrestling and a visit to the Emperor and Empress, it is in fact Japan that has risen to the global stage as an architect and defender of free trade, with a counterweight to Chinese trading practices. Now, this observation is important because while growth possibilities are important and significant around the world, I'll argue with you that the key question in advanced economies is actually whether domestic political concerns for some industries, for some jobs, for some wages, whether those actually stand in the way of the growth that is possible both as a matter of science and as a matter of economics. It's worth noting the obvious in an audience like this, and particularly standing here in Japan. productivity growth will be the key to economic growth. Mechanically, of course, there's productivity growth and growth in labor inputs, but it is productivity growth that will dominate the growth discussion. I expect that to dominate the G20 discussion as well. And in that regard, your second panel today, which is focused on shareholder engagement and corporate governance, is important as a link to productivity growth. In economies today, both technological change, more importantly, and secondarily globalization, are driving productivity growth. They are also driving the anxiety that accompanies dynamism. Let me make a basic point that I want to talk about with you this afternoon. Both globalization and technological change are not manna from heaven. They require public support. The current U.S.-China trade conflict, I think, puts this tension at center stage. I understand that Japanese business people are largely watching this conflict unfold as spectators, but global leadership by business people is required both to address trade tensions and, more importantly, to secure popular support for economic dynamism, whose wake of change can be frankly unsettling to people, maybe not people in this room, but to many voters. Failure to address that anxiety is spilling over into international tensions, most notably the tensions between the United States and China that I referred to a moment ago and I'll highlight today. Those tensions, manifested as well, obviously, in global financial markets, reflect economic concerns over a breakdown in global supply chains, the possibility of competing internets and technology platforms, and higher defense expenditures by both the United States and China. Left unchecked, those consequences will diminish the productivity growth that is possible, and as a consequence, diminish living standards. To be blunt with you, domestic political concerns in the West, along with China's global assertiveness, have both global growth and post-war liberal international order on the watch list. Now, in Osaka, coming up, the G20 summit provides an excellent opportunity for global reflection about the near-term prospects for economic growth, of course, but also the chance to explore issues in longer-term growth prospects, financial stability, international trade relations, and sources and consequences of populism. Near-term slowing of global growth and policy stimulus in the event of a downturn are obviously going to be subjects of the G20 summit. China's capacity for additional debt and stimulus, the U.S. Fed's exploration of more unconventional monetary policy, and Japan's consideration of an increase in the consumption tax all raise concerns on that stage. Osaka, of course, is quite well suited to be the host city. It combines symbols of modern success of the Japanese economy, success made possible by technological change and globalization, along with symbols of a bygone and celebrated past. Tensions both across economies, like the US and China, and within economies, domestic politics, highlight the need to move quickly to maintain broad support for openness, for dynamism, for things people in this room take for granted. My first point, Econ 101, and I can look out and tell that was your favorite subject. You just have that look. Econ 101 focuses on gains, on average, from trade and technological change. But if you go back to Econ 101, I'm sure the professor standing in front of the room reminded you that while those gains are there on average, they're not there for every person unless gainers compensate the losers. Trade and technological change are not just the panacea of Economics 101, they're disruptors. Trade skirmishes always abound, but the real attention being paid right now is in the long simmering, now I would say boiling over, trade frictions between the United States and China. That dispute is very important. It's very important for Japan, as well as for the United States and China. And in some cases, or in some instances, is actually reminiscent of trade squabbles between the United States and Japan in the 1980s, a period that I think was formative in President Trump's own views of and understanding of trade. Now, the Trump administration has been criticized, and rightly so, by many economists and business leaders for emphasizing America's bilateral trade deficit with China. But the president has, I would argue, rightly called out China for unfair trade practices with respect to intellectual property and technology transfer, and cited anxiety that is quite palpable in the United States about China's China 2025 strategy. Politically, and this is very important for the economics, it's the dislocation in the U.S. economy and labor market that have created many economic losers along with winners. And that's also an issue globally where policy has not, as in the Econ 101 version, led winners to compensate losers. Criticism of bilateral trade balance focus is obviously on point. It's worth reminding, because the error keeps being made in policy circles, the gap between exports and imports for a nation, whether it's the United States or any other country, is just the mirror, the reflection of the gap between national saving and national investment. Holding that latter gap constant, any smaller U.S.-China trade gap would simply be offset by a trade gap between the United States and some other nation or set of nations. It's in that textbook sense that President Trump is, as Hugh Patrick said, wrong. If that concern were relevant, and I don't think it particularly is, it would be easily fixed by China, which could simply shift its own purchases. But alas, that's not really the issue that parties are worried about, nor is it really the issue that's vexing politically. A larger issue is that U.S. criticisms of China's approach to intellectual property do have a point. Diversion of intellectual property and coercive transfer of technology from the U.S. and other foreign firms are, of course, commonplace in China. And China's continued reliance on subsidies to state-owned enterprises and state-directed credit failed to match commitments at the time of its accession to membership in the World Trade Organization, commitments that led me and other economies to try to persuade our then president to let China in. An even broader challenge to China's WTO membership privileges could, of course, be mounted by the United States. But to do so, such an approach would require better coordination and cooperation with key allies, Japan being most particular, but also the European Union and Canada. The approach of better coordination, of course, is sadly not being presently followed by the U.S., but it could be, as with Japan's leadership to reconstruct the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I would argue the obvious that the tariff and non-tariff barrier brinksmanship is serving neither the U.S. nor China very well. China, of course, will have to decide whether it will comply with the WTO's rules. The U.S., hopefully with key allies like Japan, should force that conversation. Underneath this tension lies another real concern, the aggressive China 2025 strategy. But there too, the U.S. and other leading industrial economies, I would argue, should pivot away from criticizing China. China can have whatever strategy it wishes, toward a recommitment at home to government support for basic research, for encouragement, as we used to have, of more government university business collaborations in technology. Both the United States and Japan have historically been leaders in that regard. The U.S.-China trade rift should really prompt G20 discussion of how better to advance an open trading system in which leading countries are actually abiding by commitments to WTO membership, and how to challenge countries that aren't. The benefits of globalization are obvious, but so too, politically, are the domestic dislocations caused by both legitimate gains from trade and unfair trading practices alike. I would urge that a thoughtful G20 discussion of globalization should move beyond the usual hymn or paean to trade to an acknowledgement of these dislocations. Again, an additional useful approach would be for the U.S. to re-engage with TPP. Japan assumed a leadership role after the U.S. withdrew from TPP. While the U.S. Japan bilateral talks are continuing, obviously, TPP still remains a better economic measure, and with the U.S. involvement, an actual counterweight to China. Now, technological change is the other major disruptor of advanced economies and labor markets. It too has the feeling of a no-brainer. While creating opportunities for productivity growth and gains in some industries and some jobs, it also disrupts other industries and other jobs. Though technological change doesn't deliver the us versus them villains that international trade can do, it also poses some significant dilemmas for public policy about how to achieve mass prosperity and mass flourishing. And a basic challenge is how to maintain broad public support for dynamism, especially if that dynamism creates many winners and many losers. Now, having emphasized this disruptive feature, both of trade on the one hand and technological change on the other, I want to turn to public policy discussions as a counterbalance to disruption. It's obvious, not only looking at the United States, but the United Kingdom, France, the recent European Parliament elections, the elections in Brazil, that these economic forces are having political consequences in the G20. Concerns over trade and over dynamism itself are inflating populist pressures in many leading economies. The scope and the pace of these changes is really putting pressure on G20 economic leadership to slow or reverse the engines of growth in globalization and technological change. And again, political transformations throughout the world, particularly in the West, are highlighting, I think, the failure of political and economic elites to address this anxiety and not find opportunity. Current policies, for example, in the United States in this regard, are both small and poorly designed. They convey to workers experiencing dislocation a virtual lack of concern for their well-being in economic terms and in political terms. These failures reflect very mild palliative policies for dislocation, policies that are too weak to fix the problem and too weak to address opportunity, and leave the impression that mass prosperity is an empty phase. Those failures also reflect policy errors made during the global financial crisis, in which financial institutions, on the one hand, were bailed out with taxpayer funds, in itself not a bad thing, but while housing wealth and employment losses of average households and average people were met with tepid policy response. This has fanned the flames of populism, and there is a danger that those flames can grow to the point that growth prospects from technological change and trade are derailed. For economists and for policymakers, for business leaders, and even business schools, this concern is critical. I think if you talk to economists studying productivity growth and you talk to business people at its forefront, virtually no one, other than my former colleague Bob Gordon at Northwestern, is an extreme pessimist about productivity. In fact, people are very optimistic about productivity growth. Productivity booms tend to lag the emergence of new general purpose technologies. If you think historically of electrification or internal combustion engine, mainframe computing, the internet, today, of course, artificial intelligence and machine learning, that promise is there. The question, I think, is less about technology and economics as it is about politics, as to whether the political process will remain too focused on the status quo to permit those gains. Bringing those themes together, I come to my third and final theme, which is a renewed focus on mass prosperity, and not just prosperity on average. Global leaders going to the G20 summit need to be engaged in securing benefits from openness and dynamism. The TPP, global pressure on China, those are leading examples of valuable engagement across countries. But I think the G20 leaders also have both the opportunity and the necessity to confront head-on challenges from globalization and technological change. How? I would argue using a GPS. And by GPS, I mean growth, preparation for work, and support for work. Those three things together should do the trick for mass prosperity. To begin, growth should still take the center stage. I know it is commonly said today that a rising tide no longer lifts all boats and growth is irrelevant. Don't believe that. Don't believe it whenever you hear populist claims to that effect. It's just not true. President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors did a very helpful study pointing out that an average U.S. worker's income today would be substantially higher if that worker had the benefit of historically high productivity growth from the 1948-73 period with today's income distribution, as opposed to an experiment the other way around of more favorable past income distributions, but slower productivity growth. Growth matters. It matters a lot. Not to have a pun at our president's expense, it trumps everything. The key is really to assure that more people get to participate in growth. In that sense, preparation for work is important. The labor market challenges posed by technological change and globalization are not the policies many countries' labor policies were designed to address. Those policies tended to address temporary layoffs, not what today we would call structural unemployment. Governments will need to assist the preparation both for younger workers and for older workers who are in job or skill transitions. In the United States, for example, community colleges, two-year educational institutions, have been at the forefront of this. Around the world, you can think of examples in vocational education, in apprenticeships, a variety of models. The G20 should focus here. Along with Hank Paulson and Erskine Bowles in the US, I've called for a thorough rethinking of US policy in this regard. We need to have a much greater emphasis on preparation. But support for work is also critical in the G20. In most G20 economies, low-skilled, low-wage employment competes with social insurance benefits for non-employed individuals. And that competition is quite unfortunate because the loss of work, moving out of the workforce toward social insurance benefits, denies somebody the opportunity to advance in work. Attachment to work is really important both economically and politically. Economically because of its facilitation of skill building, and it's that skill building on the job that advances wages and careers, but also politically through the maintenance of individual dignity through social connection. How to do this as a matter of economics varies across countries and economists' thoughts. One idea is to use tax credits to augment earnings of individual employed workers. The United States has a version of this in a policy called Earned Income Tax Credit. Another idea, one father of which is my colleague and Nobel laureate Ned Phelps, is to use subsidies to employers to boost labor demand for low-skilled workers. The G20 and finance ministers with them, I think, need to place greater emphasis and spending on these kinds of policy interventions to advance both mass prosperity and support for openness and growth. With the backdrop of President Trump's visit to Japan and the upcoming G20 summit in Osaka, now's the time for action. Indeed, that summit coming up offers a very important setting to discuss and evaluate measures within and across economies to support openness and technological change. There may have been a time maybe not that long ago, when those two things would have been taken as granted, and of course we support them. Politically, that is obviously not true today. Speaking here today in Tokyo, as all the panels will do, I think we should all in the United States hope that global leaders emulate Japan's leadership while emphasizing policy tools to make sure that prosperity is mass prosperity and flourishing is mass flourishing. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.